Picture this. The sun hangs mercilessly over the stone walls of the Colosseum, its fire pressing down on thousands of sweating bodies, packed shoulder to shoulder. Dust rises with every stomp of the crowd, each grain catching in the throat, each breath. Heavy with the metallic sting of iron and blood, beneath the roar there is another sound, a trembling wooden gate straining against chains, the low moan of something alive, waiting to be unleashed. Man stands alone on the sand, bare feet sinking into soil stained, darker than earth. His chest heaves. His eyes dart not toward the sky, but toward the shadowed mouths of the cages around him. The smell of sweat and burning oil drifts across the arena. The heat bites his skin. The silence before the next scream feels sharper than a blade. The crowd does not see him. As flesh and soul they see him as spectacle, their cheers, a storm drowning the pulse of his fear. Imagine standing there knowing that in moments the gates will burst, and your life will be fed to their hunger. This was not entertainment, this was the ritual of cruelty, the theater of death, and the walls still whisper of what they witnessed. At the height of its empire, Rome was a city of marble and shadow, a city where emperors raised monuments to their glory, while in the same breath they orchestrated spectacles of blood to secure loyalty and fear. The gladiatorial games were never just entertainment. They were a language of power, a theater where life and death were scripted by rulers for the eyes of the masses. Senators and generals sat on polished marble benches draped in purple, their presence alone turning death into policy, their gestures of approval or disapproval, deciding who lived and who died. The common people crammed into the tiers above came hungry, not for bread, but for distraction, their cries echoing like thunder, demanding blood to soothe their poverty. Their anger, their restless nights, the arena became the stage on which Rome rehearsed its identity. Strength, dominance, control. What followed would shatter lives and leave scars across centuries. It is tempting to imagine the games as contests of courage. Yet the truth was far more insidious. They were rituals of obedience, reminding every citizen, slave, and soldier that the empire's power was absolute. The crowd roared not only for spectacle, but for release. The violence on the sand became a mirror of their own frustrations projected outward, until mercy itself was drowned by noise. For the rulers, it was calculation. The games bought silence and loyalty, a tide of applause that muffled dissent. Emperors who feared unrest fed the people bodies instead of justice. And for the victims, the games were the end of every dream, the crushing weight of chains, the dread of dawn, when footsteps in the corridor meant their name had been chosen. Imagine a prisoner dragged from a cell damp with mildew, eyes straining in the sudden glare of daylight. The smell of urine and rusted chains clings to his body. Guards shove him forward toward the brightness of the arena. The roar that greets him is not the sound of welcome, but of appetite. Early records tell of criminals condemned not just to death, but to death as theater. Some were dressed in costumes mocking gods and myths, forced to play roles that ended in their slaughter. Others were tied to stakes awaiting the snarl of lions imported from deserts. Far beyond the empire, their golden eyes gleaming as they circled the helpless. Children were sometimes spared the blade, yet not spared the sight, their small hands covering ears as fathers fell and mothers screamed, swallowed by the crowd's fever. Rome claimed these acts were justice, yet justice here was twisted into a tool of control, a performance where suffering was currency. And so the games grew, feeding not on courage, but on cruelty. Each new spectacle pushing the boundaries of horror, each new death ensuring the silence of the restless city. This was not the glory of Rome. It was its shadow, stretching long across history. Beneath the grandeur of white stone arches and towering columns, the Colosseum was more than a monument. It was a machine built to feed blood into the hungry mouth of empire. From the seats above it gleamed like a temple to spectacle. Sunlight cutting across polished marble, the crowd fanning themselves with scraps of linen, the air trembling with anticipation. But step below the arena floor, and the scene transformed into a labyrinth of darkness. narrow tunnels stretched like veins. Through the belly of the Colosseum, lined with cages and barred cells, the smell of damp hay mingled with the stench of sweat and waste. Here slaves whispered prayers to forgotten gods, while handlers tugged at chains, restraining lions, panthers, and bears dragged from distant lands, their roars shaking the earth before they ever touched. Sand wooden elevators creaked in the shadows, operated by teams of men unseen to the audience above. Ropes groaned, pulleys spun, and with a sudden crash, a platform rose bursting into sunlight, releasing terror into the ring. Trapdoors opened, without warning, swallowing men into pits or spitting animals into the crowd of captives, a choreography of death, rehearsed and perfected, to the thousands seated above this. Brutality was illusion made, flesh a drama where blood and sand became ink and parchment, the story written in screams. Imagine the moment a condemned man hears the mechanism grind beneath his feet, the faint rattle of chains, then the gate slamming. Open a lion emerging with mane aflame in the sun. There is no fight, no chance, only the inevitable slow collapse of a body as claws rake across flesh, the crowd roaring as if the empire itself had triumphed. The cruelty was not an accident, it was design. The very stones of the Colosseum conspired to ensure that no cry went unheard, no drop of blood went unseen. And yet, for all the spectacle above, silence ruled the underbelly. Behind the gates, men clutched each other in darkness, some whispering words of courage, others already weeping mothers, humming lullabies to children who would never leave alive. The crowd would never hear these sounds. They were filtered out, replaced by music of trumpets, drums, and cheers above. It is here we see how cruelty was normalized, how it became woven into the daily rhythm of life. Rome taught its citizens to cheer at pain, to treat human suffering as celebration, to equate violence with order. The games turned horror into routine, so that mercy itself became strange. An act of weakness in the eyes of the mob. The psychology was simple yet devastating. When thousands scream together, the conscience of one dissolves into the hunger of many. And when emperors raised their hands to decide life or death, the crowd saw not murder but majesty. This was how an empire kept its people loyal, by giving them blood to drink through their eyes. The Colosseum was not simply a place. It was an idea carved into stone, an idea that cruelty could be polished into spectacle, that dominance could masquerade as justice, that silence could be broken only by screams. And still beneath the ruins, today the tunnels breathe heavy with echoes. Footsteps whispers the faint creak of ropes long vanished. The machinery of blood never truly rests, it lingers in memory, reminding us that the line between spectacle and savagery is always thinner than we wish to believe. The games were never limited to combat. They became theatre in which death itself was the script, and the condemned were unwilling actors. To the emperors, this blending of myth and execution was genius. It bound cruelty with culture, it masked punishment as performance. Imagine a stage set not with curtains, but with sand, not with painted backdrops, but with real fire. Prisoners were dressed as characters from old legends. Prometheus chained to a rock, Icarus bound with waxen wings, Orpheus standing with a lyre. But unlike in poetry, there was no escape, no miracle, no return. The myth ended, not with triumph but with screams. Prometheus was not visited by an eagle from story, but torn open by real birds, starved for days until flesh was their feast. Icarus did not soar into the sky. He was flung from scaffolds, wings strapped to his arms, before his body shattered against the earth, his cries drowned by applause. Orpheus was not killed by fabled beasts, but mauled by lions whose claws gleamed under sunlight, the strings of his lyre snapping as his body convulsed. The crowd saw legend. The victims felt only agony. Executions staged, as theatre were Rome's darkest mirror. To burn a man alive was not enough. He was dressed as Hercules, The hero who wore fire willingly, his body painted with pitch, his costume catching flame as thousands watched. The smell of burning flesh mixed with incense, offered by priests, the illusion complete for the audience, yet unbearable for the man consumed. By fire, every myth became a sentence, every role became a tomb. And what of the crowd? They cheered as if at a festival. Mothers pointed for their children to watch, as if cruelty could be taught alongside alphabet senators, leaned forward, eyes shining, not with disgust but with fascination. Imagine the condemned standing in that final moment, listening to the wave of sound around them, knowing they had become a story for strangers, a memory without mercy. There was a spectacle called damnatio ad bestias, the condemnation to beasts, a punishment reserved for those Rome despised. Most condemned criminals and war captives were thrown into the arena, stripped naked or dressed in mocking costumes, then left defenseless as animals were released. A man might be dressed as Actaeon, the hunter punished by gods, transformed into prey, then set upon by hounds, while the crowd howled in delight, or a woman made to play Pasiphae bound into a wooden bull, the structure set aflame until both theatre and victim were reduced to ash. The cruelty was precise, calculated, crafted to entertain and humiliate in equal measure. And always at the center was the silence of the victim, broken only by sudden screams that rose and were swallowed by the roar of thousands. Even their final breaths were orchestrated into performance, their deaths choreographed to match myth, their suffering disguised as devotion. But it was not devotion. It was control over the body of the condemned who could not choose their fate. Control over the crowd, who believed cruelty was culture control over the empire itself, reminding all who watched that Rome's power was more enduring than mercy. The games blurred lines between faith and fear, theatre and tyranny, until the audience could not see where one ended and the other began. What was left was not myth, not justice, but the hollow echo of domination. And in that echo, we hear the truth. Rome's greatest stories were written not in ink, but in blood. Beneath the roar of the arena, another story unfolded, one quieter yet more enduring than the myths and executions. It was the story of the gladiators, men who lived in chains but fought as legends. Most were slaves captured in war, sold in markets, branded like cattle, dragged into training schools where discipline was carved into their bodies with whips. They ate coarse bread and beans, their sweat dripping into sand as they drilled from dawn to dusk, learning to wield weapons not as soldiers of freedom, but as entertainers of empire. And yet some became names whispered with awe across Rome. The paradox was cruel. They were adored by crowds, worshipped like heroes, yet they slept each night behind locked gates, their lives owned entirely by masters. Imagine the clang of metal at first, light blades sharpened on whetstones, sparks flying in dark corners of the barracks, the murmured prayers of men kneeling before wooden idols carved from scraps, voices trembling with hope that fate might look kindly upon them. The heavy silence before combat, when every breath felt like a countdown, when even the air seemed to pause, waiting for the trumpet's call. And then the gates opened, and the men stepped into fire. The crowd saw spectacle, but the gladiator felt only the weight of survival, a shield pressed into his arm, until veins throbbed, a helmet heating like an oven under the Roman sun, a sword that felt both salvation and curse. When steel struck steel, the sound rang like thunder, echoing against marble walls, the impact vibrating through bone until hands went numb, and when a man fell, the arena changed. The roar dimmed as eyes turned to the emperor, seated in shadow beneath the canopy, his thumb poised like a god deciding the boundary between life and death. A single gesture carried the weight of existence, thumb pressed downward, and a life ended to the roar of approval. Thumb raised and mercy was granted, but not from compassion, only as another act of power, a reminder that survival was not earned, It was gifted by authority. For the gladiator, even victory was hollow. He walked away, scarred, exhausted, haunted by the faces of those who would never rise again. And yet crowds adored them. Women whispered their names in taverns. Children carved their likenesses on walls. Merchants sold trinkets in their image. They became heroes, enslaved, and celebrated all at once, their fame, a prison of its own. The rulers understood this paradox and used it skillfully. By raising some fighters to stardom, they dangled hope before the masses, suggesting that even in chains, glory was possible. But it was an illusion. Glory in Rome was built on the broken bodies of others, dominance masquerading as admiration, cruelty disguised as honor. The psychology of the spectacle was insidious. It taught citizens to equate power with mercy, violence with strength, submission with survival. And so the gladiator stood not as a man, but as a symbol, reminding all who watched that Rome's grip reached beyond flesh, into the very soul. When the dust settled and the arena emptied, the silence returned, broken only by the distant sound of weeping from families who had watched brothers, fathers, sons vanish into sand. In that silence lies the truth. The games were never about courage. They were about control. Rome did not worship gladiators. Rome consumed them, turning blood into entertainment, obedience into ritual, dominance into spectacle. And still today in the ruins, if you close your eyes, you can almost hear the echo of steel, the whispered prayers, the cry of a fallen man raising his hand begging for mercy that never came. Rome's hunger for spectacle was never sated. Each act of cruelty demanded another, grander, darker, more impossible. What began as duels between men swelled into carnivals of slaughter designed to shock and overwhelm. The Colosseum itself was transformed into an ocean, its floor flooded with water, carried through channels dug by armies of slaves. Imagine the moment the gates opened, and instead of sand, there was the shimmer of a false sea, sunlight rippling across the surface, oars slicing through the water as miniature warships clashed before tens of thousands of eyes, naval battles staged in the heart of the city, men chained to decks fighting not only one another, but the rising tide, sinking ships dragging screaming bodies beneath. The surface, the crowd cheered as if watching history itself reenacted, yet every drowning was real, every gasp for breath stolen for their amusement. Animals, too, were forced into these watery arenas, crocodiles thrashing lions dragged into rafts, elephants trumpeting in terror as they slipped and collapsed into the shallows, their bulk crushing both captors and captives. It was not victory, it was theatre. Not devotion, it was depravity. And all of it was wrapped in language of glory. Emperors declared these spectacles as gifts to the people, a celebration of empire, a promise that Rome's power could conjure oceans in stone and death in abundance. But beneath the triumphal banners, the truth was raw. This was cruelty, disguised as majesty, excess painted as generosity, domination hidden within celebration. At its height, under emperors drunk on blood and applause, the games reached unimaginable scale. One festival claimed the lives of thousands in a single day. Warriors, criminals, slaves and beasts all consumed in a storm of screams and dust. Imagine the smell of charred bodies mixing with seawater, the cries of drowning men colliding with the laughter of children, the sky dark with vultures circling above, as if Rome itself had summoned them for the emperor. It was a gesture, a whim born from boredom, a demonstration that his will could command life and death on a scale that defied comprehension. For the crowd, it was intoxication, a rush of spectacle that blinded them to mercy, and for the victims, it was silence, silence that stretched across centuries, reminding us that beneath the language of glory there was only suffering. This was not triumph, this was the abyss dressed in marble. When the cheers finally faded, the echoes did not vanish. They lingered heavy in the air, carried on the silence of those who survived. Survivors walked away with scars etched deep into flesh and deeper still into memory, men who had killed. For spectacle, unable to sleep without hearing the roar of crowds, women who had watched husbands and sons perish in sand left hollow behind their eyes. Slaves carried the trauma quietly, their whispers at night filled with the names of those who never returned, their silence itself, a rebellion against forgetting. The cost was not only human, it was carved into the empire itself. Each festival devoured fortunes, entire treasuries emptied to fund games that grew larger and bloodier with every rainships built only to sink in artificial seas, beasts hauled across continents to die in cages, all for the fleeting roar of applause. Rome paid in gold, but also in spirit. Every act of cruelty corroded the soul of the empire until spectacle mattered. More than mercy, until bloodshed became the language of rule. And when the empire began to fracture, when famine and invasion pressed at its gates, the games no longer distracted the people. They revealed the hollowness within. Crowds thinned the roars, became murmurs. The arenas once filled with life and death now stood in uneasy silence, marble cracked by weeds, gates rusted shut. What had once been called glory was now a memory heavy with shame. Imagine walking through the ruins centuries later, the arches still towering, but the sand below empty, the cries of thousands reduced to whispers carried only by the wind. The silence feels thicker than stone, as if the walls themselves still remember what was done within. Rome's cruelty did not vanish. It collapsed under its own weight, leaving behind not triumph but warning. In that silence lies the aftermath, not just of an empire, but of every soul consumed in its hunger for spectacle. The games have ended, yet their shadows remain. What was once framed as glory now reveals itself as cruelty disguised as celebration, violence dressed in ritual suffering, performed as art. The Colosseum stands in ruin, but not in silence its stones. Breathe with memory, each crack holding echoes of the screams that once filled the air. Cruelty masked as entertainment leaves scars deeper than empire. It reshapes how generations see power, how they define strength, how they mistake obedience for devotion. And though Rome has fallen, its lessons have not. Even today, echoes survive in the spectacles we consume, in the hunger for dominance, in the applause at another's pain. The stage may have changed, but the psychology remains. The crowd still gathers the roar, still rises the line between spectacle and savagery, still trembles under our feet. Remembering is not only history, it is warning. To forget is to repeat, is to become the very shadow we claim to condemn. The ruins whisper, not of triumph, but of warning. The walls remember even when history forgets. If you wish to walk further with us into forgotten shadows, if you wish to hear the voices that history tried to bury, subscribe and join us, so these stories are never lost. Again, so that silence does not win and memory is never erased.